June 11, 1968, Harlem, New York. Just after noon. The church doors swung open and the sound hit the street first. Crying. Not polite crying, not quiet. This was ugly. Men in dark suits stood frozen on Lenox Avenue. Cigarette smoke drifted into the summer heat. A black Cadillac idled at the curb, engine rattling low, like it was nervous too. Inside the church, Frank Lucas was shaking. Not from fear, from rage. He stood 3 rows back, head bowed, eyes locked on the casket at the front. Mahogany, gold handles. Flowers stacked so high they looked like they were suffocating it. Bumpy Johnson was dead. The man who gave Frank his first real job. The man who fed him, the man who protected him. Frank wiped his face with a handkerchief already soaked through. People around him whispered. Poor Frank. He loved that man. Lost without him now. Frank nodded when they looked at him. He played the part. But inside his chest, something else was happening. A clock was starting. And it had 90 days on it. Because while Harlem mourned, Frank Lucas was already counting. Not days, not weeks, territory. The preacher's voice cracked as he spoke about loyalty, about family, about respect. Words floated through the church, heavy and slow. Frank didn't hear them. All he heard was Bumpy's voice from years earlier. Watch everyone, especially the ones who smile. Frank swallowed hard. The casket sat there, closed, sealed, final. And that's when it hit him. With Bumpy gone, there was no shield anymore, no buffer, no one standing between Frank and the wolves already circling outside. He felt it in his spine. Someone behind him leaned close and whispered, "You all right, Frank?" Frank didn't turn. "I'm breathing," he said. That was all. Outside the church, men were already making moves, phones ringing, drivers sent away, meetings scheduled quietly. Harlem wasn't grieving, Harlem was rebalancing, and Frank Lucas was standing in the most dangerous place possible, front and center. The organ began to play, low, slow, a funeral march that dragged every second out like it wanted the pain to last. Frank's hands clenched. His knuckles went white. Because buried with Bumpy wasn't just a man. It was protection. It was permission. It was safety. And Frank knew something no one else in that church did. He didn't plan to fade away. He didn't plan to beg. He didn't plan to wait his turn. He planned to take everything. Every corner, every dollar. Every man who thought he was weak. But standing there watching that casket, he also knew the truth. If he moved too slow, he'd be dead. If he moved too fast, he'd be dead. And someone, maybe already inside that church, was deciding whether Frank Lucas would make it to summer. A woman sobbed loudly near the front. Frank flinched. His breath shortened. Because buried beneath the hymns and the flowers was one brutal fact. Bumpy Johnson was gone, and now Harlem needed a new king. Frank Lucas lifted his head, his eyes dried, the tears stopped. And for the first time that day, he looked around the room. Not as a mourner, as a survivor, as a thief standing at the edge of an open vault. But what Frank didn't know, what no one told him, was that Bumpy Johnson had left something behind. Not money, not land, a warning. And ignoring it would cost Frank more blood than he ever imagined. And that's when it started. 3 days after the funeral. Frank Lucas sat alone in a narrow apartment on 137th Street. No music, no visitors, just the hum of a refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic bleeding through the window. The suit from the funeral hung over a chair, still smelling like sweat and lilies. Frank hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the casket. And every time he opened them, he saw the same problem. He had no title, no official seat, no name that carried weight on its own. Bumpy had been the wall. Frank was just the man standing behind it. Now the wall was gone. A knock came at the door. 2 quick taps, 1 slow. Frank didn't reach for a gun. He didn't rush either. He stood, straightened his shirt, walked calm. When he opened the door, Willie Roberts stood there. Willie was skinny, always sweating. One eye twitched when he lied. "Frank," Willie said too fast. "You all right?" Frank stepped aside. "You here to pray?" Willie walked in, looking around like the walls might hear him. "They're moving already," Willie said. "Meetings, back rooms, names getting thrown." Frank nodded. "Who?" Willie hesitated. That told Frank everything. "Say it," Frank said. "Ellsworth," Willie whispered. "And Vincent. They saying Bumpy's territory needs order." Frank smiled. Not happy, sharp. Order meant control. Control meant cutting Frank out. "How long?" Frank asked. "Nobody said," Willie replied. "But they ain't waiting months." Frank walked to the window, looked down at the street. Kids playing stickball. A woman yelling from a fire escape. Life going on like nothing changed. "Did they mention me?" Frank asked. Willie scratched his neck. "They said you was emotional." Frank laughed once, short. "Emotional," he repeated. That was the word they used when they smelled blood. Willie leaned forward. "You gotta lie low, Frank. Let it settle." Frank turned slowly. "Lie low," he said. He stepped closer to Willie. "You ever see a man drown?" Willie shook his head. "He don't thrash," Frank said. "He gets quiet, then he's gone." Frank grabbed his coat. "I ain't drowning," he said. Down the street, a black Buick rolled past the building, slow, too slow. Frank watched it disappear. "They watching already?" Willie said. Frank nodded. "Good." That night, Frank walked into Small's paradise. Music hit him first. Drums, horns, sweat and perfume tangled in the air. Every eye flicked toward him. Some nodded. Some looked away. Frank moved through the crowd, calm as ever, and slid onto a stool at the bar. The bartender leaned close. "You brave coming here alone." Frank ordered whiskey. Brave ain't the word. He took a sip. Burned. Good. 2 men sat down beside him. Not friends, not strangers. They didn't look at him. One spoke quietly. "You holding anything right now?" Frank didn't answer. The other man continued, "Because people don't like uncertainty." Frank set the glass down. "I don't like vultures," he said. The men stiffened. Frank finally turned. "You think I don't see you counting?" he asked. "Measuring?" Silence. "I ain't asking permission," Frank said. "I'm warning you." The first man stood. "You got nothing without Bumpy." Frank stayed seated. "You wrong," he said. "I got time." The man laughed. "Not much." They walked away. Frank stayed, finished his drink. As he stood to leave, his hands trembled for half a second. He hated that, because here was the truth Frank Lucas wouldn't say out loud. He was alone, surrounded, outnumbered, and the men circling him didn't want a conversation. They wanted a funeral. But what they didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that Frank already had a plan. Not to defend, to replace. And once he started, there would be no slowing it down. But first, someone had to fall. Friday night, after midnight. Rain slicked the pavement outside Small's paradise. Neon lights bled into puddles. Music thumped through brick walls like a heartbeat that wouldn't calm down. Frank Lucas stood in the alley behind the club, coat collar up, cigarette burning down to the filter. He crushed it with his shoe. A door creaked open. Ellsworth stepped out first, heavy-set, careful eyes. A man who liked to talk while others did the work. Behind him came Vincent, younger. Mean smile, hands that never stopped moving. Frank stayed still. Ellsworth spoke first. "You picked a loud place?" Frank shrugged. "Nobody listens back here." Vincent laughed. "You always had jokes." Frank didn't smile. They moved into the back room, one bulb hanging. Table scarred with old knife marks. The smell of beer soaked into the walls. No guards, no witnesses. Ellsworth sat. Vincent stayed standing. Frank stayed by the door. Ellsworth folded his hands. "We've been thinking." Frank cut him off. "You've been counting." Vincent stepped forward. "Careful." Frank looked at him. "Sit down." Vincent hesitated. Ellsworth raised a finger. Vincent sat. That mattered. Ellsworth cleared his throat. "Bumpy's gone. Things got fragile." Frank nodded. "Things got honest." Ellsworth smiled thin. "That's one way to put it." A glass clinked somewhere in the club. Music swelled. Laughter floated through the wall like none of this mattered. Ellsworth leaned in. "You don't have the reach, Frank. Not alone." Frank stepped closer to the table. "I don't need reach," he said. "I need space." Vincent snorted. "Space costs money." Frank placed something on the table, not cash, a small notebook. Ellsworth's eyes flicked to it. Frank tapped it once. Names, routes, times. Vincent leaned forward. "What's that supposed to be?" Frank met Ellsworth's eyes. "Leverage." Ellsworth didn't touch the book. "You threatening us?" Frank shook his head. "I'm inviting you." Vincent slammed a hand on the table. "You got nerve." Frank's voice dropped. "You got fear?" Silence. Ellsworth exhaled slowly. "You think Bumpy would have wanted this?" That landed. Frank stiffened. It's just a fraction." "You don't get to say his name," Frank said. Ellsworth watched him closely. "You grieving, Frank. Makes men sloppy." Frank smiled again. That sharp smile. "Grief makes men honest," he said. "I ain't pretending no more." Vincent stood suddenly. "This ain't going your way?" Frank didn't move. The gun on the table caught the light. Vincent froze. Frank hadn't put it there. Ellsworth had. Ellsworth spoke calmly. "Sit down." Vincent's jaw tightened. He sat. Ellsworth slid the gun closer to himself. "Here's how this goes. You hand over what you got, you stay breathing." Frank laughed. Quiet. "You think that's the deal?" Frank asked. Ellsworth tilted his head. "You got a better one?" Frank leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "I already won," he said. Vincent scoffed. "You alone." Frank's eyes flicked to the door. Footsteps passed outside. Slow. Deliberate. Someone stopped on the other side. Ellsworth noticed. "So," Ellsworth said carefully, "who else knows about this meeting?" Frank didn't answer. The door handle turned. Ellsworth's face changed. Just a little, but enough. Because in that moment, Ellsworth realized something. Frank hadn't come to negotiate. He'd come to test. And the test was already failing. The door began to open, and then it got worse. The door opened slow, not kicked, not rushed, controlled. A shadow stretched across the floor first, then a shoulder, then a face Frank knew. Big Sam. Bumpy's old driver. Thick hands. Crooked nose. A man who never spoke unless it mattered. Ellsworth's throat tightened. Vincent shot to his feet. "What the hell?" Big Sam didn't look at him. He looked at Frank. Evening, Sam said. Frank nodded once. That was it. No hugs, no words about the funeral, no comfort. Ellsworth stood halfway, palms out. Sam, this ain't... Sam raised one finger. Ellsworth stopped talking. The room felt smaller now. The bulb flickered. Sweat rolled down Vincent's temple. Ellsworth forced a smile. We're just discussing arrangements. Sam's eyes finally moved to him. Bumpy made arrangements, Sam said. Frank watched Ellsworth carefully. That name again. Ellsworth swallowed. Bumpy's gone. Sam stepped fully inside and closed the door behind him. The click echoed. Before he went, Sam said, he told me something. Vincent laughed nervously. Old men say lots of things. Sam turned his head, just enough to acknowledge Vincent's existence. He said, Sam continued, if anyone rushed for his chair, it'd be you two. Ellsworth's face drained. Frank stayed quiet. Sam reached into his coat. Vincent lunged for the gun on the table. Frank moved first. He kicked the table hard. The gun skidded off, clattered to the floor. Vincent froze. Sam pulled out an envelope, thick, yellowed. He slid it across the table toward Ellsworth. Ellsworth stared at it like it might bite him. Open it, Sam said. Ellsworth hesitated. Sam leaned closer. Open it. Ellsworth's fingers shook as he tore it open. Inside, photographs, meetings, handshakes, back alleys. Ellsworth with men he shouldn't know. Vincent passing packages at odd hours. Ellsworth whispered, Where did you get these? Sam nodded toward Frank. No, Ellsworth said quickly. No, Frank didn't have this kind of reach. Frank finally spoke. I didn't, he said. He picked up the notebook from the table, flipped it open, blank pages. Vincent's eyes widened. That was empty? Frank closed it softly. Always was. Ellsworth looked between the book and the photos. You baited us, Ellsworth said. Frank stepped closer. I watched you, Frank said. That's all. Sam continued. Bumpy said you'd try to squeeze Frank out before the flowers died. Ellsworth's voice cracked. We was protecting what he built. Frank leaned in close enough to smell Ellsworth's breath. No, Frank said, you was stealing it. Vincent reached for the door. Sam blocked him without turning. Vincent stopped. Sam looked at Ellsworth again. Bumpy said one more thing. Ellsworth whispered, What? Sam's voice dropped. He said, Don't trust the tears. All eyes turned to Frank. Frank didn't flinch. Ellsworth's lips trembled. You cried at his funeral. Frank nodded. I meant every tear. He stepped back. But grief ain't loyalty. Ellsworth slumped into the chair. So what now? He asked. Frank glanced at Sam. Sam shook his head. Bumpy didn't want them dead. Vincent exhaled in relief. Frank picked up the fallen gun, checked it, empty. He tossed it back onto the table. I don't need bodies, Frank said. I need silence. Ellsworth looked up. You gonna let us walk? Frank bent down until they were eye level. You walk, Frank said. You disappear. Vincent barked a laugh. You can't erase us. Frank straightened. Sam stepped forward and placed a second envelope on the table. Bank slips, lease papers, names crossed out in red. You already erased, Sam said. Ellsworth closed his eyes. Vincent whispered, This ain't over. Frank turned to him, quiet, cold. It is for you, Frank said. Sam opened the door. Rain poured harder now. Thunder rolled far off. Ellsworth stood slowly. He paused at the doorway. Bumpy trusted you too much. Frank met his eyes. No, Frank said. He trusted you too little. They walked out into the rain. Frank stayed behind. alone with the dripping bulb and the echo of Bumpy's voice in his head, because the twist wasn't the fake notebook, or the photos, or the gun with no bullets. The twist was this. Bumpy Johnson had already chosen his successor, and Frank Lucas had just finished the test. The rain washed the alley clean, or at least it tried to. Ellsworth and Vincent walked fast. Heads down, coats pulled tight, shoes splashing through puddles like they were already late for something worse. They didn't look back. They knew better. Across the street, a black Cadillac eased away from the curb. Inside, Frank Lucas sat in the back seat. No driver talk, no radio, just the soft hiss of rain on glass. Big Sam drove. Neither man spoke for 3 blocks. Finally, Sam said, "You sure about this?" Frank stared out the window. Neon signs blurred. Faces vanished behind steam. "Dead men make noise," Frank said. "Living men disappear." Sam nodded. "They won't stay gone forever." Frank's jaw tightened. "They won't have a choice." The car turned onto Lenox Avenue. Something changed there. Men standing on corners stopped laughing. A dealer tucked his hand inside his coat. A lookout crossed the street. Eyes followed the Cadillac. Frank felt it. Not fear, recognition. By morning, Ellsworth's phone would ring, and no one would answer. His bank accounts would stall, his suppliers would hesitate, his doors would stay closed. By nightfall, Vincent would realize every place he used to sit had someone else in it. Not by force, by permission being quietly revoked. Frank stepped out of the car in front of a brownstone he didn't own yesterday. Sam stayed inside. Frank stood under the stoop light, rain dripping from his hair. A man across the street watched him, then nodded. Once. Frank returned it. Upstairs, Frank poured himself a drink. His hand didn't shake this time. He sat at the table and laid out papers Sam had given him. Roots, names, numbers, all clean, all ready. He didn't smile, because winning felt heavier than losing ever did. A knock came at the door. Frank didn't flinch. He opened it. Willie stood there, breathless. "You heard?" Frank stepped aside. "Come in." "They gone," Willie said. "Both of them, phones dead, doors locked." Frank took a sip. "Good." Willie stared. "You did this in one night." Frank set the glass down. "No," he said. "I just stopped waiting." Willie shook his head. "People scared." Frank walked to the window. "Fear's loud," he said. "It passes." Outside, a siren wailed somewhere far away. Frank thought about Bumpy's casket, about the warning he almost ignored. Don't trust the tears. He had cried. But he hadn't hesitated. That was the difference. Frank turned back to Willie. "Tomorrow," Frank said, "tell them where to find me." Willie hesitated. "You sure?" Frank nodded. "Because if they're going to look," Frank said, "I want them looking at me." Willie left. Frank stayed. He sat in the quiet, listening to the rain slow to a drizzle. In less than 90 days, Harlem would move different. Not louder, tighter. And Frank Lucas would stand exactly where Bumpy Johnson once stood. But the payoff wasn't the territory or the money. It was this. Frank had learned how to win without firing a single shot, and the streets would never forgive him for it. Morning came slow. Gray light crept down Lenox Avenue like it was unsure it belonged there. Store owners lifted gates halfway. Coffee steamed from popper cups. Men spoke in low voices, heads close together. Something had changed. No shots, no bodies, no sirens. That was what scared people. At Small's Paradise, the back door stayed locked. No meetings, no whispers. Just music and dancers pretending the night before never happened. Ellsworth's name didn't come up. Neither did Vincent's. It was like someone erased a sentence mid-thought. A man who used to collect on Tuesdays didn't show. Another man stepped into his place by Wednesday. No announcement, just adjustment. Inside the brownstone, Frank Lucas washed his face in the sink. Cold water, steady hands. He studied himself in the mirror. Same man, different weight on his shoulders. Big Sam arrived just after 10. He set a bag on the table. "Keys," Sam said. "Offices, cars." Frank looked inside, didn't touch them. "You talk to anyone?" Frank asked. Sam nodded. "Everyone who matters." Frank closed the bag. A knock came again, this one softer. A club owner stepped in, hat in hand, nervous smile. "Just wanted to say," the man began, "we're here if you need us." Frank nodded once. No promises, no speeches. The man left, lighter than he arrived. By afternoon, the streets knew, not officially, but in the way men cross the street, in the way eyes lower. Willie watched it all from the corner. He found Frank later. "They ain't asking questions." Frank poured 2 drinks, handed one over. "They don't want answers," Frank said. "They want direction." That night, Frank walked alone. No guards, no entourage. He passed Bumpy's old spots, the barber shop, the corner bench, the club doorway where Bumpy used to stand and watch. Frank stopped there, streetlight buzzing overhead. For a moment he felt it again, the loss, the anger, the fear he'd buried deep. He closed his eyes, then opened them. A man across the street gave him space. That was new. Frank went home, locked the door, sat in the dark. Because someone always pays for change. And Frank knew the bill hadn't come due yet. By the end of summer, Harlem felt tighter, not quieter, not calmer, measured. Corners held longer. Deals took less talking. Men thought twice before making moves they couldn't finish. Frank Lucas didn't announce himself. He didn't have to. Every route led back to him. Every pause carried his name, even when no one said it out loud. Ellsworth and Vincent were never seen again. Not dead. Worse, forgotten. That was the cost of trying to move too fast after Bumpy's funeral. The unexpected consequence came from the street. Young runners started copying Frank's style. Less noise, more patience, watching instead of lunging. It made Harlem colder, smarter, and dangerous in a different way. Frank stood one night at the edge of Lenox Avenue, watching traffic slide past. The same spot where Bumpy once stood. Same shadows, different rules. He didn't feel pride, he felt distance. Because winning without blood left room for something else to grow. Suspicion. Everyone wondered how Frank did it. And what he'd do next. Frank turned away from the street. Went inside. Closed the door. Because the man who cried at Bumpy Johnson's funeral was gone. Replaced by someone who learned the hardest lesson in Harlem. You don't take an empire with bullets. You take it by knowing when to put the gun down and who to leave standing. If this shocked you, wait until you hear how Frank Lucas nearly lost everything to the one man he trusted most. Drop a comment. Would you have let them walk? Subscribe. The next story is even colder.